I think we're living in a world where there's a lot that history can inform. And it's not that I look back with a lot of nostalgia on the past. I think we can learn from the good, the bad, and the ugly. But there's a whole world of plants and practices of environmental care and stewardship that always fascinated me more. And I think with my work in museums, I was really looking more at people's backyards, how our ancestors survived day to day, made food, medicine, improved aesthetics in their lives, created beauty. And that's an important part of what I think all of us can do. I think I'm so grateful that today's April 1st because winters are long and the world's a little goofy these days. And I feel like one of the things that I love about gardeners and being in a community of gardeners is every spring we know that you look backwards and you think, what worked, what didn't work, how can I apply that to make this year's garden better? And then we dive in again and we get our hands in the dirt. That's a superpower. A lot of people in the world don't understand that you do have a chance for a fresh start every year as a gardener. And that makes a difference in people's nature. And I think right now is a good time for all of us to be thinking about resilience and how we keep ourselves grounded, but also how we can make a difference one backyard at a time, because it is important to remember that we can make a difference and that you start doing that locally. And then what happens in our backyard goes out into the garden club, and then the garden club goes out and it's a green space or a watershed, and we share these things, and that's part of the power of community that we get too. So I'm guessing we probably won't get the lights down any further, so I'll probably just go forward, and that's fine. Can you all see pretty well? Okay. So the book I came up with was the one you see on the screen, The Heirloom Gardener. It's really beautifully illustrated with woodcuts from Mary Azarian, whose books many of you might know as well. And I felt so fortunate to get her to illustrate this book. So it's not just a collection of words, but what I'll do today is take you on, oh, thank you. I can't see you, no. On a little tour through some of the thoughts and ideas in the book. And I'll have them back there afterwards as well. So, nope. Sorry, this isn't my computer, but we will find the way. There we go. So there's another woodcut on the screen from Mary Azarian that says, "When the world wearies and ceases to satisfy, there's always a garden." And I don't know about you, but I've been really eager this spring to get my hands in the dirt and start doing some of that work that's real, that you can feel yourself coming back into place. I look at gardening as an art and a craft, something that we can curate, find all the things that we love, the plants we love, the structures we love in a garden, and really turn them into our own backyard art. And I think for centuries people looked at gardening as a craft, just like woodworking or sail making or cooking or whatever it might be. And that was something you learned and you got better at every year. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be that person who's more technologically savvy as I get older, but my garden is a place where I know that I will continue to improve every year. And that's heartening to know there's something that we become sages in. And there are kids all around us that need what's in our heads and that want to and will benefit from what we can share in those experiences. And that's part of the beauty in gardening too. So one of the concepts that runs throughout the whole of the book is a sense of place. I have a quote in here that's in the book as well from Linda Hogan, who's a Chickasaw writer. And she writes, "Walking, I am listening to a deeper way. Suddenly, all my ancestors are behind me. Be still, they say. Watch and listen. You are the result of the love of thousands." Where I grew up on the South Shore, I grew up on a river. And that river was my haven, just like I think so many of us find the gardens to be. And when I walked through those deep pine woodlands, There were stone walls that ran through the woods, and you could feel the craftsmanship that had gone into making them hundreds of years ago when that was farmland and not woodland. There were still ancient paths running through the woods. We had the 17th century well on our property, but all through that landscape ran mahocassin flowers, or moccasin flowers as we've come to know them, or ladies' slippers. We see so much in the native plants that were introduced in that same landscape that gave places name, that helped us understand our place in that landscape. I was raised at what was once called the Fox Hill Shipyard back in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. And we still had foxes that played on the hill slope behind our house and raised kits every year. To me, that's a sense of place. I knew where I was from. And that's me swimming in the river. That's me raising up young families of rabbits that were chased apart every year, riding my tricycle down the driveway. And the next nearest house to ours was a shipwright's house and tavern with a 60-foot tall Roxbury russet apple in front of it that had been there since the 17th century. And I include this here because, Roxbury russet apples have endured the ages because they're tough, hardy, heirloom apples, heritage apples that no bug is really that interested in because the skins are durable. But when the new neighbors bought that house, they had no idea what was there, and they cut down that tree because to them it made a mess in the yard with something that they couldn't even recognize as an apple. To me, this is why a sense of place is so important in our underpinnings, in what we bring to place as gardeners. So whether that's coming to a place like Rockport, where the name of your place, like Fox Hill, tells you a lot about the landscape. Talking to other gardeners here today, this idea of planting on ledge and bedrock has its own piece of that history. But the first immigrants that came here were fishing and farming, and that's still evidenced on the landscape. Downtowns like this came about once roads came along and improved circulation, but most people came by water for a very long time. You can see that in the orientation of a lot of houses in the landscape. Once trains come in, that develops another whole aspect of what can be done here. And then you see new generations of immigrants quarrying and harvesting stone from the landscape. And then regional tourism developing, because underneath all that, we could realize the inherent beauty in a landscape like this. The Irish have a saying, tenalach, which is used to describe the relationship that we have with the land, the air, the water, and those deep connections that help us really hear the earth sing. When I used to live in Japan, there were studies being done about Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, that helped us realize that the chemistry and the essential oils that evergreen trees put off was actually enhancing our mood and our well-being just by walking through and being in the woodlands around us. So to me, it's that engagement in our sense of place that makes such a difference when we are gardening or tending the landscapes that we inherited. I have this picture of a maple tree here because there's a great old quote, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote about how, there are things in this world that you want to support and there are things you don't want to support sometimes. And we each get the chance to do that in our backyards and around our kitchen tables. He would say in his day and age, if you don't want to support slave plantation owners, don't buy sugar. But if you buy maple syrup and maple sugar, you're keeping your farming neighbor alive and thriving. So now maple syrup is in my morning coffee. That's my sweetener of choice. And those are little choices that we make, or we're tapping our own maple trees. And when you do that, you're more aware, like all of local agriculture, of the air quality, the soil quality, the water quality where you live as well. And we become better stewards at the same time. So, do you remember that advertisement on TV when we were younger that said, this is your brain on drugs? Well, this was my brain on plants as a kid. And actually, you mentioned Lauren Dow, my neighbor. This is one of her kids in the hull of an old apple tree in the backyard over at Sanctuary Arts. To me, how we get others engaged is critically important. So I want to ask all of you to think back to who taught you to love gardening and the landscape. Anybody? You can just shout it out. Grandmother, parents, neighbors, father, mother, uncle, aunt. So all of us we've all needed somebody to help us make those connections, somebody to help us fall in love with what we see. Rachel Carson wrote, "If a child is to keep their inborn sense of wonder, they need the companionship of at least one adult who can share it, rediscovering with them the joy, excitement, and mystery of the world we live in." I love thinking about Rachel Carson in this context because if you look back on her life and accomplishment, the work she did writing Silent Spring caused a bipartisan effort to create the EPA. That meant, as a nation, we said we value the stewardship of our natural resources as our shared cultural inheritance. That's huge. We can't expect kids are going to fall in love with a landscape, especially with the lure of blue screens everywhere, unless we're making those connections for them. Jane Goodall wrote, "It would be absolutely useless for any of us to work to save wildlife without working to educate the next generation of conservationists." And clearly right now that's something we all need to be doing. And I love to look around in garden clubs and think, have you ever had Grandkids Day or Kids Day in your garden club where you bring in the next generations? These are really important times to be engaging the next. So I put in some pictures of things like a children's garden I designed for Massachusetts Horticultural Society, kids loving up nature. And in my book, I really try to create lots of inroads for connecting the next generation to the landscape. One is creating herbaria. Have any of you ever heard of an herbarium? So through the centuries, what we would do is press botanical specimens. And especially when young women were denied an equal education, this was sort of the inroad to the sciences that was permitted. So herbaria became these documents of place and your own backyard, and you became a household botanist. You might learn hundreds of plants in your backyard. Herbaria in different museums where I've worked ranged from very young, immature handwriting to the most fine handwriting, saying things like, well, common and botanical name often. Oh, found at grandfather's grave. Grandmother says it can be made into a wonderful tea this way. And those points of engagement that you would take through the rest of your life. And today, they become a great document of place. The Queen Anne's lace you see on the bottom, that's from Emily Dickinson's herbarium. There are so many now that inform us of bloom time and climate change and all kinds of things that we have to learn from our past. There's a wonderful quote in here from Nicolette Sauter saying, "Children grow up hearing how broken the environment is, how broken beyond repair. Plant strawberries together, make wild medicines, paint the sunrise, show them proof that for every act of destruction they can sow a seed, however small, of beauty." Kids need that encouragement as much as we do. And sometimes when you're teaching those kids, it's that reassurance we needed too along the way. But for kids today, they recognize it's said to be fewer than 10 animals and plants in their backyards, but they know hundreds and hundreds of corporate logos. That needs an intervention, and that's us. So to me, I write about things like herbaria as a way to create a backyard document. And actually, for Bedrock Gardens, I just met with faculty at UNH, and we're looking at starting up an herbarium for Bedrock Gardens as a training, so that all generations and all volunteers and everybody learns this skill, and then we do it in the public realm. So it becomes a backyard craft. And in essence, this whole book is about turning things into craft. And sometimes that's with a sense of humor, too. You've probably all heard of the language of flowers, and we have a long history where plants told stories. If I was to ask you, what does a red rose mean? Everybody? Love. You look across the world, in every culture, red rose means love. Not everything falls into line quite that way, but people would ascribe different meanings to plants. Some of them are built into the names, like forget-me-nots, or something like a violet might have we know it's an evocative plant because you can only hold the scent of a violet for 7 seconds. So it comes and it goes and it comes and it goes. So all of these things were put into posies in the Victorian age that were like sending secret messages. They're kind of like a classier version of an emoji for the 21st century. But they were ways to have fun, and ways you can have fun with kids again, making secret messages through posies, and letting those stories of plants speak more loudly. I write about native plants in the landscape as well because I think as all of us get older, we're learning more about stewardship. And maybe we weren't as aware of native plants decades ago, but we're not the first generation to come to this place. By 1640, the first immigrants here were sending plants back to Europe that were heralded in every garden in Europe as the bee's knees, goldenrod and asters and all these New World plants that we took centuries to appreciate. But by the time of the American Revolution, we were up against, fancy that, embargoes, and we started to boycott British teas. So we said, well, we're Americans now. We should be drinking American plants. So they had a movement of liberty teas saying we should grow native plants. So that was probably our first native plants movement as Americans. But it really helped us focus on putting those things back into the landscape. Do any of you make herbal teas from some of the plants in your gardens? So a lot of those that you'd see here are among some of my favorites too. Things like bee balm and wintergreen, goldenrod and New Jersey tea and Oswego tea. But we also remember that when we're working with native plants, it's not just what it does to improve our quality of life, but it's putting back into an environment what the native critters were accustomed to finding. Do you remember before weed whackers, how we used to have meadow ground everywhere? The sides of roads would look a lot more like this in fall. You'd see acres of roadside goldenrod and asters and milkweed. And sometimes when we think about what we do with native plants, it's important to plant them, but it's also even more important to just not cut them down, to let things grow back as meadow. When you think of have you noticed the trees are starting to flower? One maple tree might have millions of flowers. That's really important to the pollinators. So it's like making priority to leave the trees, to let some of your landscape go back to meadow or flowery mead, as they used to say. And know that when you do that, you're going to see the return of the monarchs and the pollinators. It's also good to know that this has always been a complex issue, and nobody's saying only do one thing. If you look at Rosa rugosa, that's been here since the 13th century. Does that make it native? Is that long enough? Is it? Clearly the world is complex. And so it's never to say do one thing only, in my mind. It's finding the balance and trying to make way for natives and heirlooms that have been underrepresented for a while. So I try to write about some of those details and complexities to make them simpler. Really ways that we can think about ecological gardening in our own backyards, because as important as we know it is to build community, it's also that our backyard is a community, it's habitat. And when we build on that community, if I'm not mowing down that field, that's when my nighttime sky looks like this, with fireflies and whippoorwill song and all of the crickets that come out when you leave some wild space around you. The first time I'd ever planted Ilex verticillata, or winterberry, in my yard, that red berry that you see here, I had enough to cut finally, and I put branches in the urn at my front door. And in the first snowstorm of winter, I counted 14 bluebirds that had swarmed in and ate every berry off of that winterberry. I had never even seen a bluebird in my neighborhood before that, But you also know then they're going off, flying downriver, pooping winterberry seeds all over into the marsh in little pre-fertilized packets that we're going to grow. And that's part of building habitat too. It's the subtleties behind all of this. It's letting the leaves stay on the ground so that you get salamanders and fireflies. It's leaving the native lobelia so that you're getting hummingbirds back in your landscape. Or those cool swallowtail caterpillars that have fake, they look like false eyes that happen if you leave sassafras and spicebush in your property. All of these things are part of the encouragement for habitat building. Also, if any of you work in public settings like school gardens, I always love to start with those native layers in a landscape because it's just another reminder that horticulture moved, and even among the native food crops, they all migrated here to New England from the Southwest too. And so if I'm planting at this time of year, I love looking at these regional indicators for safe planting time. Do all of you know shadbush or Amelanchier canadensis with the white flowers that you see? When that bloomed, the natives of this region knew that it was safe time to plant anything else by seed. Memorial Day meant nothing, so you watched for indications like that, and you'd start planting your corn and beans and squash. Today we know that that process of planting the Three Sisters gives you the highest yield per acre of any other method of planting known in the world, pound for pound. It gives you a completely nutritionally balanced diet, and all three of those things can be overwintered and saved as crops to eat. So that becomes really important in places like school gardens where you walk away for the summer, but you can come back to all of this in the fall. And it's also science and social studies and history right outside a kid's garden door. I also write about things like foraging. How many of you grew up foraging? I see about 4.5 hands. Okay, let me rephrase this. How many of you went out picking blueberries and blackberries and raspberries? Maybe helped a grandmother from somewhere away pick mushrooms. And yeah, we all grew up foraging. It's not just the domain of Brooklyn hipsters. We all get to claim that. And it's something that when we do forage, again, like local agriculture, it makes us care about the quality of the environment. You think about those things where you don't necessarily think about it if something just came from a market via the Midwest and you had no connection to it. This is my friend Kathy Gunst in the middle with some ramps. We were doing a piece for NPR. She's with Here and Now. And it's taking a look at these native plants that we can not just grow in our own yards, but we can help rematriate, put back into a landscape where they've long gone absent sometimes. So while foraging can be about planting, it can also be about bringing some of these things back, like the black walnut and the blackberry, the ramps. From that one gathering trip that we took for ramps to do that piece, I saved some seeds, and I took about 6 little plant rootlets, and now I have a pasture, like 6 little pastures of ramps growing in my backyard, where none have been probably for hundreds of years, but because of the springs that come up there, I'm pretty sure they always would have been there in the past. It's nice to think of ourselves as a part of a cycle like that as well. So I write about things like fiddleheads and ramps that we can put back into our landscapes. How many of you have eaten fiddleheads in spring? Back to a sense of place, it's a pretty New England thing to do. I write about them as being sort of like the moxie of vegetables. They are definitely a pungent, peaty taste, but they're beautiful. It's that whole Fibonacci sequence spiral that it just makes any dish beautiful, but I also think they are a wonderful part of that spring gathering that reminds you, okay, we're back in sync with the season. The first immigrants here used to call them the first knots and buds of the gardens, the first greens we could get from all that stored up energy in the ground over winter. So I write a lot about perennial vegetables as well, things that we can be cultivating, both native and introduced. And those old ways that really carry a lot of subtlety. If you think back to your grandmother's chicken soup kind of thing, think of all the ingredients that went into it, but a big part of it goes back to Linda Hogan's love of the ancestors. So much goes into the care that was taken to cultivate. And if we think about what we put into our bodies, it's sure nice to think about something that we were able to cultivate and grow with love, or that came down through a farmer in our community that we knew cared. So I write a lot about the old ways that infused our New England mindsets. Some of the earliest feasts and the collaboration between native diet and first immigrants here, every generation of immigrant that followed afterwards, ways to raise produce in cold frames and start plants in hotbeds, raised beds, composting, movements that showed us how to can, things like the Victory Garden movement that reminded us that a nation could turn on a dime and pull itself out of a hole and set up a space where within a year we fed almost half the nation produce from their own backyard victory gardens. Almost half of our nation's produce came out of those gardens and their success. So for me, it's important to look at those models, things like school gardens and seed saving, phases of the moon that we can plant by or harvest by, that always were a big part of the influence in the past that kept us connected to the earth and to place. When I look at this image in the middle, I see my grandmother, and I think of sitting on her piazza, shelling beans or tipping and topping beans. You know, when we did things like that, when we spent time in process, we spent a lot more time talking. I think America right now could use a lot more time spent talking about the green beans than red and blue. I think there's a real healing that comes through conversation around tables. And I sometimes think back to what Thomas More wrote, the ordinary arts we practice every day at home are of more importance to the soul than their simplicity might suggest. It's what the choices we make every day, the conversations we have every day, common conversation around a table instead of positions. Those are the things that really build what and who we are. And sometimes when we get into the process of saving seeds and we actually show a kid how to save a seed and they're growing that same seed out for the next year's crop, that's a deep connection that doesn't get forgotten and a flavor that doesn't get forgotten. And when we share old recipes, it's the same thing. I was walking up here with a friend actually over in Gloucester, and we found this old crabapple tree. And my friend Betsy Williams said, "Oh, I remember, we used to make pickled crab apples, pickled spiced crab apples." I was like, well, pull up that recipe out of your brain computer and let's try to remake it. And so we made pickled spiced crab apples. I hadn't had them for decades, and it just brought about something that now, whenever I come upon crab apples, I try to do because it's a phenomenal thing that you just can't buy anywhere. So it's, again, those little connections that we can play around with. Another that I write about in the book at great length, obviously, because that's the title of the book, is about heirlooms. Who knows what an heirloom is? Anybody want to throw out a few concepts behind it?
I'm just thinking it's seeds that have been passed down, seeds that you harvest, dry, and replant the next year.
Yeah. So they've been passed down, typically with heirlooms we say for at least 3 human generations. Anything else? So, yep.
It would be genetically modified.
Right, they're not genetically modified. They are open pollinated, which means you can collect and save them, and you're adapting every generation to the soil in your backyard, to the length of season, to the all the conditions. Or you like the red one, or this one came in disease resistant, or it was the first tomato of the harvest, or it was the sweetest watermelon. So every generation was influencing that. So when our ancestors left us seeds, they left us the most improved seed for place. Over time, by World War II, most of the seed companies were bought up by the chemical companies, and they wanted to patent seeds. And there's some good that comes of patenting sometimes. F1 hybrids are something that's done with careful selection, but it gives people a chance to patent and own a patent. So if you're growing hybrids, you can't save seeds. It excludes that generational connection that's so important to place. And so for all the seeds that started to be developed for agriculture in the Midwest, the apple that Rockport was known for, or a cabbage that Gloucester was known for, or all of these regional variations went away. But fortunately, we've seen a lot saved. You can see things like the Boothby blonde cucumber that was saved by a Maine farm family. These white eggplant that remind us how eggplant got its name. All of these were passed down for reasons that today become even more important. This is a chart from National Geographic a few summers ago that shows how over 90% of the crops known to feed us have disappeared over the last 100 years. And that is that Rockport apple or the Gloucester cabbage, and these are things that were of place that no longer were as important when we thought all of our future farms were going to be in the Midwest. But now we're seeing this resurgence of local farms, and we're bringing back all this heirloom connection to the land and landscape. So in my life's work, wherever I've gone, I've tried to help repatriate these old plants, like this 8-row multicolor flint corn that we know is being grown by the Wampanoag when I was at Plymouth Plantation, or the white carrot seeds that we found in seed packets, or this bean, the cranberry bean that we found in brown paper packages tied up with milkweed string that we know today was grown in backyards in Portsmouth, New Hampshire since, well, for over 1,500 years now, but was lost right after the Victory Garden era, when all of a sudden you started to see other beans replace that. So now what we try to do is get them in the hands of every farmer, every chef, and if a chef gets them in their hands, it becomes the next seed for a community to save. And this is a wonderful way that we've seen a revitalization in our local markets and marketplaces. There are so many connections that are made in our local farms and fields. Do any of you have farmers markets or farms that you go to around here? That shift, I don't know, did you ever imagine you'd be seeing a resurgence of local farms? To me, that's a pretty wonderful thing that keeps us grounded in the possibilities, but it also means we're thinking about our environment again. The grains that we can grow. Where I live, you can buy breads made with local grains. You can buy meat, beer made with local grains, and alcohol. So much in the farmer's market is of our local produce with local heirlooms. And so on those days when I'm holding my head in my hands thinking about the state of the world, I have to think about this. This is a renaissance. We're living to also see a lot of really good shifts. When I started the local chapter of Slow Food in New England, we had fewer than 1,000 farmers markets across America. Today, can you guess how many farmers markets we have 15, 20 years later? Over 20,000, almost 25,000 farmers markets across America. That's a good shift. So hang on to those things, support those things so that we keep them going, because it also means that we know farmers, we're giving local economies a real boost, and all of us, all your kids and grandkids are start as brewers and as, craftspeople doing things with this local produce. One of my grandmothers used to say, it's better to pay the grocer than the doctor. And I love that Michael Pollan quoted me quoting my little old Italian grandmother saying that, because no matter what, and she came to this country not a wealthy woman, but she would invest into the food that they fed their family and raise a lot more of that food too. And to me, it's that whole connection to knowing that, well, today we would say you are what you eat, but there's this whole series of things that went down through history that reminded us of that whole connection of food and diet to wellness. So I encourage all of you to think back, and it's nice to be forgetting about pandemic, but did it change any of the ways you gardened and that you live? Anything comes to mind?
A lot more fresh food for dinner,
Yeah,
say and not necessarily bought.
yeah. Yeah, I forgot that I could cook as much as I did, or on a given day, a salad might look more like that because I wasn't relying on a head of iceberg lettuce. Not that that was ever my favorite, but every edible thing I could find in my yard went into making that salad. And it might have 24 different ingredients in it, but it was a way more delicious salad because of it. I think it really helped us take time to hand water, to weed, to do all of these things that maybe was always better for the environment anyways. If you're getting into water crises around here, that hand spot watering, some people pay to go to classes on meditation. That's my favorite meditation in life. Weeding is a great meditation. They're all a part of that grounding that I think is so important, that also gets us out from behind blue screens and silly news, that really sometimes we need to step away, and this helps us nurture ourselves and our families. I think for me, a lot of it too is watching people's backyards and gardens become more like a homestead than a garden and a house. I know a lot more laundry lines went up in my neighborhood, and back to another meditation. When I'm hanging laundry, I'm kind of channeling my grandmother because I'm thinking, how's this going to capture the wind? How does this? All of these things are another meditation in life when we can find ourselves the time to do this, to live like this. Some people I know started raising chickens. I started keeping bees. They're all wonderful ways to reconnect to the land where we live. There are a couple of plot designs here from the Victory Garden era that, if you look back to our parents and grandparents, so much of what we probably know about gardening is because the government and universities and cooperative extension services and garden clubs all work to reconnect us to the land at a time when we were forgetting how to garden already by the 1940s. We were so enamored with a canned, that we could eat something canned in the middle of winter. But how many of you now think a can of spinach or canned peas is good? It's, like we've realized there's this whole food movement that reminded us what true flavor is like and brought us back to the value of living a little bit more with this as a part of our daily life. There's an older quote, a version of this one from Louis Neisser that goes back to St. Francis of Assisi. But I love the way it expresses this. A man who works with his hands is a laborer. A man who works with his hands and his head is a craftsman. But a man who works with his hands and his head and his heart is an artist. All of us get a chance to be artists in our backyards and create this thing that we love. And if you've ever been to the place where I work, Bedrock Gardens, you'll also see it's a chance to bring art and horticulture together. And now I'm bringing out things that have got a broken backside or some art that can weather outside. I'm putting all kinds of things into my landscape to help accentuate what's growing there as little artworks all throughout. And it really makes that, laundry line connect to the garden, connect to the garden shed, and a place for the bees to have their bee line to get right to the pollinator field. Most everything I'm writing about in the book, too, is writing about gardening as a craft. And I think organic gardening was just one more part of the craft that we all used to know. I don't know anybody that wants to poison the earth, but we all grew up in a generation that said better living through science. And for a while that meant dump all this stuff on your plants and you'll kill off all the bad stuff. And what we realized is, like everything in life, it's more complicated than that. And you kill off a lot of good and bad, and maybe if you have all this food waste that you can turn into compost, or if you've got a place like Neptune's Harvest just down the coast, or you've got a new way of looking at putting native plants in your landscape that have deep roots in soil like the soil we have here, we can start to rethink this. And garden clubs become another place where we share what we know about it. Instead of getting up on a soapbox and preaching, should be doing this, it's saying, how do you accomplish this? Well, what do you do if your roses are? And then we learn from each other again, the same way that all knowledge used to be passed down in gardening. Sometimes we're also shifting the way we plant, thinking about things like food forests. interplanting things in our garden landscape, the larger landscape, or applying models like xeriscaping that worked in dry and arid climates to suddenly be a part of what we're thinking about doing here on top of bedrock when there's a water shortage. Choosing the right plant for the right place has always been a big part of it, and there are a lot of plants that were meant to survive places without a lot of water, and we are probably going into a more arid future. When you look at native plants, the root systems are typically much, much deeper. That's why I also love perennial vegetables. They're always drawing up from what's there, and it's not taking a huge input every season to get things started again. But also, science is helping us to realize there's also a huge value in organic nutritionally. A plant that's raised to full ripeness in place, that's grown organically, can have as much as 70% greater nutritional value, depending on the plant, than something that's grown, harvested, unripe, and sits on, is shipped across country. You remember those cellophane packets of tomatoes that we used to get in wintertime that I can't even imagine eating something like that today, but it was like you have to have a tomato on a salad, so we'd buy those. And that tomato was created as a patent so that it could bounce off the back of a truck, pick it up off the highway, put it back in the truck, and you get it in the supermarket and you think, why did that just go from stone hard to mush overnight? Well, its genes were all bred for long shipping and long storage. You lose so much of the nutrition that way. So science is also helping us understand what my grandmother knew too, that it's better to pay your local grocer, your local farmer, than the doctor, ultimately. So one of the ways that was always made attainable through history was kitchen gardening. Your kitchen garden was always designed so it was right outside your kitchen door, not far afield so you had to get to it or you could put it out of mind. But when I wake up in the morning, maybe I go out with a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and as I'm walking through the gardens, just taking it in and appreciating the bird song and all that, I start pulling a few weeds. And then I'm thinking, oh, there's a lot of mint. There's a lot of parsley. I should make tabbouleh tonight. And those connections end up coming back to the kitchen table, coming back to our own mental and physical well-being. So for me, whether a kitchen garden is something like the one you see outside the oldest house in Nantucket that I designed, or this incredibly elaborate Belgian kitchen garden. They go back through the centuries as just that way to make it the most accessible possible so that our kids are, they're not just reminded, they learn that carrots grow in dirt and that a potato is like just digging up a loaf of bread from the ground. I remember when I worked at Plymouth Plantation, kids seeing us pulling up produce from the ground, and one kid saying, "Mom, is that where our carrots come from?" She grabbed him by the wrist and said, "Not our carrots." We have a huge disconnect in America from our sources of food, and it's really great to regrow those connections, again, especially for the next generations that really need that. One of the ways that I write about that makes that so attainable too is growing small yard fruits in our own backyards. How many of you have grown blackberries and elderberries and raspberries, gooseberries and currants? And there are so many things that provide fruit. And to me, instead of just growing, waiting all year for a big, ripe, huge tomato, the equivalent to me is like growing pear and currant tomatoes and cherry tomatoes. They're more realistic in our climate, and they get you going much earlier in the year. So I grow a lot more of the small fruits that get me through the season, and then plant some apple trees, some pear trees, some of the things that yield more. Quince. How many of you have grown quince? Bless you. Just the smell alone, that's, well, what I would call aromatherapy. I put one on my dashboard because they smell so good that it's like the best car freshener. But they also make a really good liqueur or cordial, and or a pie or a jelly or jam because of all the pectin in them. So it's getting reacquainted with what we can grow, the ordinary things, or things native like cranberries that you can grow in your own garden, all the way to pawpaws, which we can now grow here. If you don't have a lot of room for an orchard Espalier is one of those historic methods that shows us how to grow fruit trees in smaller spaces. So again, borrowing from past practices, taking inspiration from more recent. And again, bringing it back down to craft, because when you handed knowledge from generation to generation, you understood things that today we can deepen our understanding through science. It's like my grandmother would always have a wooden cutting board, but she always knew when she was done, she rubbed it with lemon or garlic. That's science today, helping us understand how to get, to make sure that there is no lingering bacteria. If you use sage today, what's a common recipe that you use sage in? Stuffing. So, you know how you read so much about every Thanksgiving, it's in the stories out there, why you shouldn't have stuffing that's cooked in a bird and you should cook it in a pan because they're deathly afraid that we're going to make ourselves sick. Do you know what sage does when you put it in your stuffing? Sage is antiseptic and antibacterial. Where's the bacteria going to form? In the cavity of the bird. So if you filled your stuffing with sage, you are making that safe. It's this whole, if you look back to most any historic recipe, it ties you into living seasonally, into the medical needs of that season when that crop or that animal is in abundance, and human health. And so, to me, it's a wonderful thing to reconnect back to garden craft. Learn how to graft an apple tree. Learn how to make pesto. While it used to be just a means to preserve things, maybe we don't need to preserve in the same way because we have a refrigerator, but you're still making pesto out of your arugula, your sage, your parsley, your basil. Again, you borrow from the past and improve on those things for the future. And that goes with so many parts of what we learned in the past through that seed-saving process. And it's also a fun movement, like the whole craft beer movement. Every community, it seems, is opening up a craft brewery, a craft distillery. They're working with a local farm to get inputs for that brewing. They have to put some food on the menu because you can't just drink without food in most of our establishments. So they're turning to that local farm community. And so all of these things help rebuild it. At this point, I've had really a lot of fun brewing with some of the top brewers from around the country. I think I've served 4 different presidents' beer and gruit that's been made from old recipes. Before we knew beer, which had ale in it as a preservative, we used to make what we call gruit. And it had vegetables and herbs, and you had spruce beer, you had ale hoof, mugwort, ale cost, all these names that told you, hey, I'm a brewing herb, go into it so that every ale you drank was seasonal. And that's part of what we're bringing back as well, is all those seasonal ales and farm connections. It's the craft of doing things like making wattle from all the free fall that we get in our yards, or the water sprouts in our orchard trees, that keeps us from buying the cheap plastic fence that ends in a landfill 3 years later. This will have as much of a lifespan, but I just keep adding on top, and keep that going. But it's also one of the most beautiful looks, I think, of anything in a landscape. I'm adding a new line at Bedrock from a local artisan who's making a lot of wattle structures for us now, too. It's also herbalism. How many of you grew up with any kind of herbalism in your house? Okay, so now I see 2.5 hands. Let me ask again. How many of you grew up having, let's see, an apple a day, maybe prunes when you needed it, chamomile for an upset stomach, mint tea, beets or spinach for iron, oranges or tomatoes for vitamin C, garlic or echinacea for your immune system? We all grew up having these things for medicine. Maybe some fennel for digestion. These are parts of what we used to know and used to pass on that made it so that it wasn't a mystery to us. Most food was medicine as we thought of it. And so there wasn't this deep divide and disconnect. And it's part of what we get to own as gardeners. We can reclaim those things because we know, well, I've been eating fennel my whole life. I can trust this. and you try some after you have an upset stomach, or you make that cup of chamomile tea, or you send a kid out and get mint and make some mint tea. Those are the ways that we start to rebuild some earlier skill sets. Because sometimes, let's see, I've learned how to go forward. Can I go back? Nope. Well, not important, but in the previous slide you would have seen some kale there. Kale was like the poster child. Oh, that's okay. I can get by without it. When we started to realize how good kale was for us and that it helped prevent colon cancer, the pharmaceutical industries instantly tried to turn it into a pill. And we realized the pill did nothing. Sometimes we just need to eat our damn roughage. It's like you are a gardener. Cook or eat these things raw. Get to know what we already know and then share it back with the next generations. Because, as we say, if you are what you eat, the past would say the cook is half a physician, pay the farmer now or the doctor later. During World War II, grow vitamins at your kitchen door. Today, if we are what we eat, we're a lot of petroleum because we're shipping food endlessly and we're using a lot of petrochemicals in our gardens. So I love to just think about what we can do, because sometimes we just need that tonic of wilderness to keep us connected. It might be in the herbs we grow, it might be in making tonics and bitters, or it might even be the fun side of things, like making cordials. Have you ever had a cordial? In New England, it's what we call a lot of liqueurs, and they were used for digestion. They were used as an aperitivo. They were wonderful things that, if you live through a New England winter without modern pharmaceuticals, sometimes you look to things like elderberry cordial. But guess what? It's also an antiviral. It's good for flu. It's good for winter medicine. Cough medicine is what? Always cherry, right? Cherry is an amazing expectorant, like elderberry is. So a lot of these were built in earlier. They were tinctures. If you could afford to sweeten it, you sweetened it, and you had another form of medicine. So I write about ways to reconnect all of these things and help us get back to living and eating seasonally. When I was a kid, I think the only thing I was aware of eating seasonally was rhubarb, or maybe a strawberry rhubarb festival, or a strawberry festival in the spring. When I went to live in Japan, everything was about seasonality. Everything you ate was something you were conscious was coming from the landscape at that point in nature. Well, as a gardener, now I know my sorrel is just about to come up. My ramps are coming up. Asparagus is next around the corner. And you live through that whole season. Right now it's maple syruping time. That's what all of this local garden movement is helping us rekindle in our own backyards or support in our local communities. And it's a lot of fun in the process of reconnecting to that wheel of life. So right around the corner is May Day. When May Day hits, every holiday in the past had its connections to plants. So at Christmas, it's holly and ivy, rosemary and bay. Why? Because that's all that was green in that landscape at the time. Well, May Day and every other holiday was about what was available. So at May Day, it was candying angelica. It was making May wine with sweet woodruff and roses, making sorrel soup and having asparagus, bringing posies to your neighbor's door, and making May bouquets. So I write about a lot of those types of things in the book. How to use all parts of the plant as well, because how many of us were taught to pinch off the flowers and we just throw them in the compost? All the old herbalists would say the flower is often the sweetest essence of the plant. So you'd never want to waste that. So today we're reminded that we can make chive blossom vinegars and calendula butter. We can make syrups of violets. And when you make an edible salad on any given day, I can find a half a dozen edible flowers that might go into that salad or top a dish or make honey or cheese or any of these other things. To me, that's play that gardeners get to do that nobody else gets to do, because, I mean, you might see a few in the stores, but they're not worth eating usually. But what you grow that's really sun-ripened, full of nectar, makes it really a lot of fun. Do you recognize the flower in the middle? Those dangling white bells? Solomon's seal. How many of you have eaten the flowers of Solomon's seal? They're like garden peas with a floral taste. They're amazing. It's like candy from the garden. It has to be the true Solomon seal, the biflorum, not false Solomon seal, but the flowers don't look anything like this. Try that. You want to get a kid involved with gardening, start offering them things like that. It's really a fun gateway drug to gardening, you might say. But also, playing in the garden. At this time of year, like wreaths were ephemeral art, way before it got trendy, before Andrew Goldworthy, and we made things with what was beautiful in its season. We hung them on the door as a portal to remind us of that wheel of life. And sometimes I think also we need that reminder, because in that wheel of life, maybe you're down here thinking this winter's never going to end, or this administration, or this person, or this work thing, or this, and this just reminds you you're going to keep coming out the other side of it. You're going to keep cycling through, and we keep enduring, just like the plants in our garden. So whether it's a fall wreath, or a winter wreath, or an herbal wreath, there were all ways to make art out of the spoils. I write about things like the lawn, where we were taught how it was a monoculture of grass or it was a crime. This is my lawn blooming in the middle in spring. I can make violet syrups, I can make dandelion fritters, but also when the cat roams along the fence top, they're playing with all the wild moths and the crickets and the chipmunks and everything else that they see out there. Kids are deciding whether they like butter or not. E.B. White wrote, "I would feel more optimistic about a bright future for man if he spent less time proving that he can outwit nature and more time tasting her sweetness and respecting her seniority." In my landscape, what is still lawn is about a third of the size of what I inherited when I bought that place. The edges look more like this now. And that Joe Pye weed and the ironweed and the milkweed, those seeds are floating down river. And on a good summer night, I'll have 10,000 fireflies in my backyard. This is how we make a difference in the world, sometimes when we think we can't. And you start here, and you get a whole garden club doing it, you get all your grandkids doing it, and your grandkids know more about this than you might. So it's sometimes nice to share back and forth across the generations. And that's why I wrote this book. It's really because we have a lot to learn from each other and share back and forth between the generations. And I don't miss that lawn. So I'm going to ask all of you now to think back on who taught you the love of nature and ask you who you're mentoring. I hope all of you think about who you can bring to another garden club meeting too, because when you look around the room, I don't see many of us with black and brown and golden hair. We are an aging group, and the youth craves what we have in our heads. They need the knowledge that gardening builds up in your head every year that you've gardened. Bring those kids. Make place for them. Teach them, find whatever means you can. Bring them to the farmer's market. These are the ways that we connect those inroads. And as Shakespeare said, there's rosemary. That's for remembrance. Pray you love, remember. Find those keys wherever we can to connect. So with all of that, I'd say if you are interested, I have my books at the back. I only do cash or check because I'm a Luddite that way. But you probably got friends here if you need to borrow something or get a check from them. Or don't worry about it. You can buy it online or at a bookstore locally and support your local bookstore. I have a Facebook page called the Heirloom Gardener, John Forti. And every day I try to post something that links you back to seasonally what's happening in your garden. Or do any of you follow that page? Not yet? Well, take a look. You can actually pull out your phone and hit follow. But I try to make it a point of encouragement in every day as well, because I think we can all use that right now. And as Emerson wrote, the creation of 1,000 forests is in one acorn, or as somebody else said, one nut that stood firm its ground. Another point of interest I'll just say to finish out, if any of you have not been, actually why don't I ask, how many of you have been to Bedrock Gardens? Well, that's just a shame. So it's also an opportunity. Bedrock Gardens is New England's newest public garden. It's in Lee, New Hampshire. It's an easy drive from here. In fact, this year we started a garden club membership, and it makes a great garden club trip. I tend to do all of the tours for garden clubs when they do come. And whether you come as a garden club person or you just come on your own, I have some postcards for Bedrock at the back. I have a mailing list for Bedrock Gardens. And I'd love to see you out there. If you go to the website, you can take a wonderful tour of the landscape. But it's over 30 acres of art, really rare botanicals, but it's laid out to take you on a journey. And as our volunteer coordinator, Deb, likes to say, you come out the other side and your blood pressure is about 20 points lower than when you came out of the world. So I just encourage you all, please come visit and take a look, or think about bringing the whole garden club out. So with that, any questions? Yes?
I just have a thinking, because
Oh, good. That's what I was
when I
gonna
do buy like heirloom tomatoes, they're expensive. They're wonderful, but they're expensive.
Mhm.
Is there any group that's working on trying to bring these better vegetables to people that don't have access to these things in the cities and
Sure.
food deserts?
Yeah, great question was about access to good quality food and heirlooms. And every farmer's market, every farm I know at the end of market turns all of their produce back out into the community, brings it to food deserts, brings it to local distribution centers. To me, what is most important in the whole heirloom equation is, if you buy an heirloom tomato and you think it's expensive, there are a lot of people that buy the newest computer and they'll spend anything to get the newest technology. New costs more, but as this normalizes and it becomes a part of the culture, that will also rebalance. But in the meantime, if you're not trying to do it on an industrial scale, organic gardening is cheaper in my world than conventional chemical gardening. And all your seeds are free, because if you bought an heirloom tomato, if you can even put a pot or 3 on your patio, you can save those seeds and never spend another penny on an heirloom tomato, because that's about the empowerment of heirlooms. In one person, in your hand, with a few little seeds, you can change distribution channels, you can change the face of agriculture, and you can grow the best tomato you're ever going to eat for free. So a big part of it is really about trying to get heirloom seeds back into everybody's hands, trying to teach communities, trying to put out recipes when we give food back into these communities of how to use it, give seeds back out into communities, and just remind, because we all know that there's a huge disparity between wealth and poverty in every community, and there's a great way to share seeds in this movement. Yes?
I have a question. I tried to grow quince once, and the poor tree was so beset by things like fungus, virus, insects, that the fruit I got off it was pathetic, and it ended up dying. How do you get your quince to grow so beautifully without using pesticides?
So I just met the first quince I'd ever seen that suffered of blight last year. I was astounded, because I had always seen them as one of the most hardy and enduring shrubs. So clearly I see that it does happen. So the primary way that I look at healthy organic agriculture is, whatever we plant is like, what we feed, what we plant is like the human diet. If you really create good compost and use manure and add good inputs to the soil, you're growing something that's more healthy, more blight resistant. Air circulation is important, knowing the right conditions for that plant. Like, that plant wants to be in the full blazing sunlight, which helps with a lot of the blights and conditions that, we've had a lot of irregular weather with some very I'd say we've had monsoon seasons for a couple of summers past where everything was suffering. So you learn organic inputs, like if you add a teaspoon or a tablespoon of baking soda to a gallon of water and spray it on plants that are suffering to a fungal disease, it will kill those fungal diseases. if you add a tablespoon of soap without phosphates and the baking soda, you're making a spray that will kill off aphids, whitefly, mealybug, all kinds of things. So there are ways you can approach that care, but I think the primary is just about the right plant in the right place and soil quality.
Great. Thank you.
And trying another variety. Sometimes I also think when you look at many of the cultivars and the nativars, they're being bred again for very different standards, and it's why I often like going back to some of the older varieties, because they didn't make it unless they could make it on their own, and that's why they came down to us through the ages. Not exclusively, but oftentimes. Yeah. Any other? Yes?
If you want to let your part of your lawn go, I mean, can you just let it go? Or-
Everybody knows their landscape best, but for me what works is don't mow right back to the edges. So first, if you have a landscape where you wanted to, say you planted some trees along the outer edges and maybe a shrub layer, then maybe you put some perennials in front of that. What do perennials want to do? Spread out and encroach. So I let them naturally start to encroach on the lawn. And then I had a big birch tree fall, and my neighbor did too, and so I took those logs and I started lining the front of those garden beds. And then every year they'd want to escape and go under the birch. So I'd roll the birch forward and I'd and until it started to fall apart, I realized, wow, just in the duration those logs had on the ground, I've gained about 6 feet of perennial bed and just areas of natural ground cover and enhanced ground cover and perennial. Those logs then are also creating a place for the salamanders. They're rotting and enriching the soil. And so it's just, you find whatever way works in your landscape, but maybe it's just letting a portion go along a rocky edge, or not cutting down, not manicuring so much. We tend to over manicure a landscape. And unless you leave room for the wild doesn't have much space. And also, think about the deer problems. If you have a thicket somewhere, like in my yard, I make some choices that somebody might think are really poor choices. I have a thicket of multiflora rose in the back. I tried to control it when I first got there. I could not get rid of it, but then I realized that's the only thing that was keeping deer out of my yard, because it's like the hedgerows in Europe. A good hedgerow will keep out deer. And sometimes I think a good hedgerow is a nice thing. I'm not recommending you use multiflora rose for that. But if you did a tangle of quince and lilac and planted up things like that, sometimes it's even a good preventative if you can situate those things well in your yard to exclude them from the landscape. Yes?
I notice a lot of trees and shrubs that got this weird gray fungus on them. Seems to eventually kill the plants. Is that from too much rain?
I'd say the past few years we've probably all seen a lot of excess rain. I'm not sure exactly what you're speaking of. If anybody else is, chime in. But if you're seeing a lot of fungal issues, think about air circulation and light. The more light that comes through, the more air circulation, the better that tends to help the situation. Also, whatever you can do to help the ground around them absorb excess moisture, maybe putting in really thirsty perennials at their base, things like that could help too. Do
One more question. If you're going to grow fruit trees, and I agree with you, if you can get heirloom, they're much more likely to survive without pesticides and everything else, which the hybrids. Do you have a good source for heirloom
Sure.
fruit trees?
I'd say living in New England, Fedco is one of my favorites. They're in Maine, and they actually have a great online program as well as a pickup day in spring. It's really worth the trip. I got some of my European quince there. I've got a lot of great heirlooms from them. And they also do some wonderful native perennials, and not just native and heirloom, but a really interesting range of wonderful plants.
Great.
Yeah. So I will be over there. I have books that I can sign if anybody wants. But also, please, even if you don't want a book, come up if you had more questions. I just don't want to keep everybody so long. But get a postcard. I also brought some milkweed seeds that Bedrock Garden put out to give away to people. And please get on Bedrock's on mailing list if you want to take a pack of seeds. And thank you.